So I see that the title of your series here is "The Politics and Economics of Transition in the Arab World," immediately begging the question of transition to what? And I, like many others, assumed back in December of 2010 that it was transition to democracy, and so we could fill in the blank. But we've been disabused of that, so I've started talking about the transition from the post-colonial to the post-colonial order. This is suitably vague and gives us more wiggle room, and so I suppose it's in the spirit of my auto-critique here that I want to introduce this today. And the auto-critique is, the Arab Spring arrives, and the question becomes, well, is the transition indeed going to be to democracy, or to what? And at that stage, I began to rummage through the social science work on democratic transitions, looking for the sort of structural correlates, if you will, of those transitions, successful or otherwise. And I came up with 7 of them, lucky number 7. And so I did a piece on that, and it was your WAGB here, your homework for the day, was reading that. It's in Survival. And I'll just quickly run through what were the 7 correlates that I found in the literature. And I thought that had sort of laid the whole matter to rest. Well, of course it hadn't, because democracy didn't appear. And other people found that this whole piece was very deficient in any case. But the structural, if you will, what I call demographic deficits, I thought the three Ds was a nice way of doing it, were at first that, and I used Egypt as the test case, although the data applied pretty well across the Arab world, that it is too young. That the literature demonstrated that for transitions to democracy to take hold and be successful, the median age needs to be above 30. Tunisia is the only country in the Arab world with a median age approaching 30, it's just below it. The median age in Egypt is 24. Secondly, it's too rural. Egypt has been ruralizing since 1991. That is to say that democratic transitions have typically been associated with periods of rapid urbanization. I think it's a surrogate measure of economic success as cities draw in people, primarily because of concentration of economic activities in cities. The fact that in Egypt, Egypt has been gradually re-ruralizing since 1991 is suggestive of economic failure. Too poor. The classic article on that came out in 1996 by Adam Prozorski, who at that stage, as I recall, had a figure of about $6,000 GDP per capita as the requirement for a sustained democratic transition. If that was indeed the figure, that would be about $11,000 now, accounting for inflation. Egypt's purchasing power parity GDP per capita is $4,500, so well below, less than half the GDP per capita figure associated with sustained democratic transitions. The middle class too small, and indeed middle class declining. Declined by 5% in numbers in Egypt and 9% in the middle class share of total wages between 2000 and 2009. And among our group here, Ishaq Douane has worked extensively on the middle class and its role in Arab uprisings, and the public opinion data we have about the middle class is how it became disaffected. So it's not only relatively small and growing smaller, disaffected as a result of economic changes in the first decade of the 21st century. Too poorly educated and trained, and I want to elaborate more on that point here today. Too materially insecure is the 6th DDD, and by materially insecure we have the World Bank's measure of vulnerable employment, in which Egypt ranks very high indeed, and then the generally rapid growth of the informal sector, so that something like 2/3 of entrants into the labor market now in Egypt are entering the informal sector, where they do not have social insurance, nor of course permanency of contract. So insecurity of a material nature, and then lastly, and somewhat paradoxically from number 6 there, is too dependent upon government. So you need an autonomy from government, especially for civil and political societies, to have sufficient material resources to act effectively. And in Egypt, that dependence upon government takes a variety of forms, not the least of which is subsidies. Subsidies as a percent of the government expenditure went from 22 to 45% from 2002 to 2009. Government employment, which I'm sure all of you are aware, is very high. The figure that really jumps out at me if I want to illustrate dependence on government employment in Egypt is from a survey done by an old colleague of mine, Jim Mayfield, in 2005 in rural Egypt. And it was a family income. And it was the sources of family income. The single largest source of family income in rural Egypt is government wages. And it was significantly higher than any other source of income, including that from any type of agricultural activity. 52% of total family income in rural Egypt is from government wages. So if we want to talk about dependency, it's the length and the breadth of the Nile Valley. All right, so I sort of like this structural approach. It suggested that, boy, it was going to be an uphill climb to democracy in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. And I gave talks based on this idea in a couple of places. And, well, other folks didn't like it. And the principal argument against it, which I then had to rethink, was you're not accounting for agency. That this is a structuralist explanation, a determinist explanation, that this is old-fashioned literature. This was the sort of thing that Seymour Martin Lipset and others did back in the 1960s. It's been souped up a little bit. But what you don't, don't take account of is the actions of the actual political actors themselves. And not surprisingly, those among you who are aware of the work of the Latin Americanists on democratic transitions no doubt will recall the work by Philippe Schmitter, Juan Lintz, and others, in which they talk about democratic bargains being struck through pacting, that pacts would be agreed between the competitive actors to guarantee the basic sort of minimax strategy. They couldn't have it all, they're not strong enough to prevail, and therefore they accept some part of what they want in return for a guarantee that they will not be removed from the game. And the one system of government that does that is democracy. And so they accept democracy as the second best option. And this goes back to Huntington and so on. And so that then caused me to think, okay, well, if we can't account then for and try to predict what's going to happen in these transitions from post to post-colonial Arab states, what about then looking at agency and what's going to happen there? And so I began then to take a little bit of a more intense look at the political actors themselves to try to explain what they might do and what they might not do. And that really then led me into these sorts of speculations that I'm going to talk about today just a little bit, and then go back, because I also didn't find too much of that. So I went back to some more structural stuff in the end, and we'll come back to that. So we know now that the actors, the key actors, had real difficulty in imagining themselves in a democratic format, that the classic Latin American pact, as described by Philippe Schmitter and others, was not the approach that either eventuated or that seemed to be in the minds of the key political actors, especially in Egypt. And we think of the military and the brothers as the most important actors, but we can add others as well. And so what was it that accounted for their unwilling to reach the sort of strategic compromise, the democratic compromise? You could argue it's cultural, that there was something about the brothers and Islam and so on, but I think it's better to go at this in a structural sort of a way, and because I also think it's true in Libya, Syria, and so on, so it's not just Egypt. So where do we go? We go to the legacies of the deep states, that these are societies, political societies, in which deep states have been very deep indeed, much deeper than their Latin American equivalents. And if you go through the literature on Latin American transitions, I think you'll see the clear difference in the depth of that authoritarianism, of the centralization of political control in the Arab world as compared to that in Latin America. And so, what do deep states do? They create inward-oriented political actors. The game is not to reach out and build coalitions. The game is to protect yourself and defend, look inward. And the brothers, of course, are a classic example of that. And so if your orientation is inward, the idea that you are going to somehow empathize, engage in effective negotiations, win over your opponents into some sort of a situation where you both get some part of what you want, is antithetical to the sort of political culture in which you've been operating. Now, of course, the other part of the deep state legacy is institutional decay. And we see it in the best institutionalized of the Arab countries, which is Egypt. And whether that institution is the parliament, the judiciary, local government, you name the institution, that the sort of the hollowing out of them as a result of the role played by the security and intelligence services, the agencies of the presidency, or the military is such that none of these institutions, and I think the best measure of institutionalization is professional and corporate commitment to them by their members, really sustained. So you had profound institutional decay, and then to follow on from here, what happens to societies under this sort of authoritarian rule? Well, they depended upon social contracts, which required centralized distribution of resources, and we are well aware of the diminution, relatively speaking, of those resources. And as a result of that, societies that are increasingly fragmenting. Some of you may have seen the New York Times article on the last weekend, going back one, about the new map of the Middle East, in which it's cut into a whole bunch of different new countries. So is the post-colonial order going to be one of a variety of new states? And some of you who are familiar with Egypt will know that this is a nightmare that haunts the country. It's something that comes very quickly to mind among Egyptians when you talk about decentralization, threats to the country. It's in terms of dismemberment. The plot is to cut us up. And so the appearance in the New York Times of this map, of course, is feeding fuel to the fires there. And what is true of Egypt, the most homogeneous, most united of Arab countries, is, of course, an infinitely greater threat in a country such as Syria or Iraq, and so on. So centrifugal forces are growing as part of these legacies. So those are the political challenges of effective transitions, and I'll leave transitions to what for discussion, I guess. So what are the economic challenges? Basically there is no model. Unlike Eastern Europe, where the clear preference was for some sort of neoliberal capitalist model as the clear antithesis to the failed communism that they had experienced, there is no standardized model for the political economy of the Arab world at the present time. The neoliberal consensus never arrived. There was lots of opposition to neoliberalism on the grounds of its failure, on the grounds of political favoritism, on the grounds of corruption, on the grounds of it being Western in inspiration and control. And so it didn't get the sort of traction it would require. The developmental state, a la East Asia, also didn't get traction, and it didn't get traction for a variety of reasons, the core of which I suspect is the relatively poor degree of institutional quality in the Arab world. That if you examine not the Confucian legacy theoretically, but the Confucian legacy institutionally in terms of the quality of East Asian governmental institutions as measured by the bank or anyone else, they are very high. They're relatively small in proportion to labor forces. They are elitist forces. And more than any other single factor, I suspect that it is those governmental institutional legacies that account for the success of the developmental state model in its homeland, which is East Asia. We all know that Arab bureaucracies are overstaffed, underemployed, and ineffective. So the developmental state model was just not on. A broad constituency of reform, not there. There's no clear model around which it could sort of gather its strengths. And as a result of the absence of a clear model, others come to the fore. One is the retrograde model, the one that failed earlier, that of various forms of state socialism, in Egypt's case, Nasser's Arab socialism. And under the Brotherhood, the idea of an Islamic financial alternative, which we heard about for a brief period of time, called the Renaissance Plan. And when the very architect of the plan was unable to specify what it was, it became clear, tragically to one and all, that there was no such thing as an Islamic model that had any degree of clarity and so on. So no established model and no real alternative. Now, part of the problem with all of this is replacing rents. That so much of Arab economies are rent dependent for so long, and as those rents in proportion to populations are declining, we have a serious problem here. Hydrocarbon rents, in Egypt's case, the hydrocarbon rents enjoyed a brief and dramatic flare, if you will. From 2002-3 to 2008, Egypt went on a gas binge. Huge increase in production, exportation, and fueling of local production as a result of newfound and newly developed reserves of natural gas, which reached their natural limit as a result of a variety of factors, not the least being the political disruptions. But so for Egypt, hydrocarbon rents are rapidly declining. Foreign assistance, well, today seems highly appropriate to be talking about foreign assistance. Egypt and the United States are currently squabbling about $1.3 billion, which is the residue of the 1979 agreement. In 1979, public foreign assistance from the United States to Egypt accounted for 10% of Egypt's GDP. The GDP of Egypt now has grown to by a significant amount since that time, and foreign assistance has dropped. So the actual foreign assistance under question today is about 0.1 of 1% of Egypt's GDP. So it's no longer a rent of such magnitude. And remittances have essentially stabilized. They didn't drop in the magnitude one thought they might have after 2008, but as a percentage of GDP, they dropped. So rents in general are, with an increase in population, the needs to capacities ratios are declining. Lastly, then, external challenges for the transitions. United States, as the sort of patron of democratic transitions, you might argue, has lost its way. That the focus on state building and nation building, which was, after all, the inspiration, at least in part, for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, seems to be gone. The responsibility to protect has inevitably been associated with the responsibility to rebuild. And the responsibility to rebuild has taken on such a magnitude and been met with such failure, from the Balkans to Iraq to Lebanon to Libya to you name it, that people just don't want to go there. And so no matter how bad things are, and they couldn't get much worse than they are in Syria, the hesitancy to engage in a rebuilding exercise when a country literally collapses, as Syria has, it seems to me is quite profound and probably unlikely to be addressed in Washington or in the rest of our fine land. European Union, we don't need to say much there. Division, problems at home, disagreement about what should be done on the southern Mediterranean region. So a sort of disinterest, if you will, in the near neighbors. International financial institutions, the Eurozone has consumed not only a lot of the resources, but much of the thinking of the IFIs, and so they have been conspicuous in their absence in the Arab Spring. The Gulf, their need for resources to shore up support at home, combined with division between the GCC members, has meant that a coherent strategy of providing assistance that would lead to long-term development in a recipient country like Egypt is also limited. And then lastly, there's the neighborhood effect of the Middle East on these transitions. And it's interesting that in every single piece of empirical work that tries to measure the correlates, going back to these structural approaches to transitions, that the attempts to measure it, which introduce a neighborhood effect, always find the Middle East is an independent variable, has a bigger negative effect than any other region of the world. That the neighborhood effect in the Middle East on democratization is extremely negative. So it's a bad neighborhood for democratic transition. So those are all then the sort of contextual factors for Egypt and the Arab world more generally for these transitions, leading then one to say, well, okay, democracy is the obvious solution to these problems of getting buy-in from people, of hammering out the nature of the political economy model that needs to prevail, and then sort of assigning the roles and responsibilities within the polity accordingly. But the political elites, as I mentioned, were not schooled in that sort of interaction. They were dealing with the deep state in vertical relationships, not in horizontal relationships with other actors. And the societies themselves, in the best measure of societal attitudes, about receptivity to democracy are the world value surveys that are done regularly. Some of you just WVS, and you will see that the Arab world tends to cluster down at the bottom in terms of the susceptibility of attitudes, or the compatibility, rather, of attitudes with democratic practices. The attitudes are very much focused on what are religious norms combined with material concerns. That is not interested in process of government, interested in the output of government. In other words, interested in patronage, not in process. And so if the WVS is any sort of indicator of how populations think and how conducive that thinking would be to democracy, the news is definitely not good. As I mentioned, non-conducive elite perceptions, institutional decay, and lastly, the external democratization industry is in decline. The heyday was under George Bush. It's interesting how little commitment the Obama administration has, and presumably any immediate successor administration, to democratization, and what a bad name that industry has in the Arab world itself. So that takes us now to the real subject of the talk, is what are the structural factors of the economy, now that we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty here, that are going to stand in the way of efforts to stimulate economic growth and political stability in Egypt. And I thought this quote from Keynes was rather nice. We get caught up in the ephemera of the day, and the Arab Spring or Arab upheavals have given us plenty of ephemera to take a look at. But underneath it, it seems to me there are some structural trends underway, and we need to look at them. And the ones that I think are of greatest import here for us really are the human, and secondarily the physical infrastructural inheritance of whoever is going to rule Egypt. Most importantly is the human resource. And what are those human resources, and how useful are they going to be for efforts to rebuild the economy? There's been plenty of damage in a sort of again, an ephemeral way to that economy. But what are the structural underpinnings? And I think here we want to look at the human infrastructure. So general human resource capacities. Human Development Indicator, the bank's HDI rankings, ranks all countries according to GDP per capita, and their ranking on human development indicators, of which the indicators are of education and health. And Egypt on HDI rankings is 20 below where it should be on GDP per capita according to the overall HDI index. It's 35 below on the education index, 35 places below where it ought to be if it were performing up to its level of wealth. Literacy, about 2/3 of Egyptians are literate, which is below the Arab average and below Turkey, as you can see. The poverty of Egypt is now only worsened in the Arab world by Morocco, Sudan, and Yemen. So those basic human resource indicators are not terribly encouraging. When we go to education, and we don't have enough time to go into these in detail, but all of the indicators that are available to us in comparative global terms suggest severe underperformance in Egypt. The TIMSS test scores are very poor. Publication rates of faculty, patents, rankings of universities, not a single Arab university in the top 500. One ranking had Cairo University 300 and something, and that was because it had one illustrious graduate. That was Yasser Arafat from the Faculty of Law. But it is in fact the Chinese government rankings that are now the most globally authoritative, and none of them rank the Arab universities in the top 500. Very low enrollments in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's below 1 in 5, which is very low by global standards, and low research and development expenditures. Now, why is education so poor in Egypt? Most important cause seems to be inequality. The poor students, which constitute about 40% of the overall student enrollment groups, perform more poorly than their equivalents in all other Arab countries. And because of the high degree of inequality in Egypt, it's a huge drag effect on overall economic performance. Curricula and pedagogy, it's interesting. that Egyptian students spend more time in courses on Islam than students in Saudi Arabia or any other Arab country. There is a misallocation of time in the classroom in the direction of Islam and Arabic. And of course, it's still wedded to, getting paid from the pockets of the parents, a bit like Harvard, I'd say, in that regard. But the issue of curriculum reform, I mean, and I agree that there is a segmentation of the Egyptian educational system, as you're aware, that's really quite profound. And what's interesting is how much the Mubarak regime encouraged the growth of the Azhari system throughout the length and breadth of Egypt. And so you would find schools, primary and secondary, in villages, nice, new, well looked after, sitting next to the public schools from the Azhari system, much more attractive to the parents and the students than the normal public educational system, with a much heavier emphasis on Islam and Arabic. So there was, and then the language schools and the international schools. There are about 5 different educational systems in Egypt, and that's part of the issue here. That you have an elitist system that's well looked after, that is not engaged in extensive use of classroom hours for, especially the international system, for Islam or even Arabic. But that's not true in general. Misallocation of resources, well, I love this one. Ministry of Education, the largest ministry in Egypt, 2 of 3 employees are not teaching. So heavy administrative overhead. Weak linkages to the labor force. Here are the figures. High school graduates, only 6% more over their lifetimes than those who have no schooling. World Bank returns educational expenditure in Egypt lower than in all regional comparators. Higher education, 126 out of 134 countries ranked. 128th in degree satisfies the labor market. So the educational system, not well linked to the labor force. Now the labor force itself has very low overall participation rate, about half. Bangladesh 71%, Thailand 72%. Female participation is about half the overall rate, and Egypt ranks 108th on this 3rd billion index of 128 countries on economic empowerment of women. There's a lovely statistics in the 2007 survey of the bank of managers, global questionnaires of economic managers, and the one that jumps out at you is the investment in training of personnel. And it is Guinea-Bissau that is the only country in which managers invested less in the training of their workforce than in Egypt. So profound disinterest in development, the quality of labor force, even in when firms directly control that labor force. Now, what has happened as a result of the stagnation of economic growth in Egypt is the growth of the informal sector. 2/3 of those working in the private sector are employed in firms of less than 10. Informal employment has grown in the period 98 to 2006 and continued to grow since that time. And what is particularly tragic about informalism is that it's so much less productive than formal entities. 3.6 times in Egypt, and the comparison between Egypt and Turkey, the figure is 6 times for firms that are formalized as opposed to not formalized. And it's not just the poor factory worker in Egypt who is comparatively underprepared for the tasks at hand. Management has a similar problem. TFF, Total Factor Productivity Ratings, which is a measurement of management performance, it's the residual of growth you can't account for by other inputs. TFP ratings in Egypt about 1/4 below China's, 40% below Brazil's. There's a nice study by some of our colleagues at the ERF in Cairo that shows the limits to growth without increasing total factor productivity. That if you fail to increase total factor productivity, the need for structural inputs, land, labor, capital, are so much greater that Egypt couldn't hope to do it. But the only path is through increasing TFP. Average age of management in Egypt is very high, suggesting the lack of creation of new firms and of an entrepreneurial spirit. and indeed very low level of business creation. And this is partly due to the predominance of informalism, very little new firm entry, lowest after sub-Saharan Africa. That's the human infrastructural situation. What about the physical one? Well, a similar state of decline. World Bank infrastructural investment has suffered a serious decline. Gross capital formation well below middle income average. Public spending in agriculture is declining faster than in any other Arab country. Environmental degradation, World Bank does regular measures of comparative pollution. Cairo was, for a while, the world's most polluted city in heavy particulate matter. It's lost that title, but Egypt's cities of over 100,000 compared to other global cities of over 100,000 ranks Egypt as the sixth most polluted country in the world. This A.N. Hewitt People Risk Index is one that's used by global businesses when sending their staffs abroad, partly for compensation purposes. And by this standard, Cairo is 112th out of 131 cities in terms of desirability to live in. So the physical infrastructure is declining as well. Governance would not normally be thought of as a structural impediment to growth. After all, it's a human activity, right? And one would think would be subject to relatively rapid change, hence not defined as structural. But because it has been so long-standing as an area of economic activity that underperforms, I simply lump it into this category of a structural obstacle. The classic 1996 World Bank first issue of their governance, comparative governance measures, Egypt scores lower now on its governance measures than it did in 1996. It has never returned to the level of performance of 1996, with one exception, which is not on the governance measure. It was on the World Bank ease of doing business measure. And for 2 years, 2008, 2009, Egypt was one of the world's best reformers. And this was much touted at the time by the traveling roadshow, then led by Yusuf Boutros-Ghali, the Minister of Finance, and various other members of cabinet, to convince global investors that money would be well spent in Egypt. Alas, what had happened, both in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, was that the folks in Egypt and in Riyadh had figured out how to game the indicator. The indicator was based on legislative changes, and among them was the creation of the General Authority for Investment, GAFI. And so GAFIs were created in Saudi, and GAFI was created in Egypt, meaning that it was a one-stop shop for businesses wanting to come there, and you wouldn't have to go to the otherwise 40-plus different agencies to get approvals. It's interesting to note that the man who was the original head of GAFI resigned, and he is now the Deputy Prime Minister of this new government. And he resigned because GAFI had no power. It was a nominal thing intended to push up Egypt's rankings on the ease of doing business measure, and not, in fact, to change the real substance of it. If you go to the substance of economic reform, you're better to go to the Arab Reform Initiative's measure. The Arab Reform Initiative, aware of the gaming nature that Saudi and Egypt had engaged in, then took structural measures as opposed to legislative measures, what actually happened in practice. And on that measure, that is looking at a series of actual performances, days spent trying to get the permit and so on, that the gap between legislative performance and actual bureaucratic performance is greater in Egypt than any other Arab country. And the hugely bloated public sector is very much a part of that. Sir, you have a question? Or small surprise then, given the structural inadequacies and all of the turmoil over the last 32 months, that the crisis is at the door. And what are the measures of the crisis? Well, the Economist has this nice wiggle room index, which is a pretty good one. And it's the ability to ease fiscal and monetary policy. So how much room have you got, basically, to print money without really getting hammered? And Egypt, on the Economist's ranking last year, was lower. It had less room, and it really stood out. It really just jumped out at you. That's how tight things were in Egypt and the danger of catastrophic runaway inflation hitting the country. Capital flight, well, the market's down. Foreign currency reserves have bounced around. The Minister of Finance recently said, well, the good news is it's gone from 14 billion to 19 billion, and so let's take the 19 billion. What he didn't say was that at least 6 billion of that, on using government figures, is money owed to British Gas and other developers of the gas fields who have not been paid their money and who have been almost up to this point reticent to go to court against Egypt to claim the funds. The Qatari shipments of natural gas have now been promised to go directly to British Gas, not to Egypt. So out of the 19 billion, clearly there is still only about the 13 or 14 billion, which is also includes some funny sorts of monies like Social Security monies that may or may not be accessible to the government.
Actually, all the 19 billion is owed to someone, and the net reserves is in negative.
Yes.
So that's the number that you look at, not the gross reserve.
Yeah, the games have been played. Look, it's not just the gross reserves that are problematical in terms of the accuracy of the figure. All of the figures are somewhat questionable, and that is also a governance issue, not only in Egypt, but in much of the Arab world. The food and fuel shortages, it's interesting that Egypt is now contemplating importing coal to cover its electricity generation needs when the boasts of the, going back to Minister of Energy, that Egypt would be the 6th largest exporter of natural gas in another decade. Egypt will not be anything like that. Its role in the world gas markets is dropping rapidly, and to maintain electricity generation, it's now looking to import coal and convert some of its generating capacity to coal. The cap-in-hand strategy, meaning going to the Gulf, well, it's met some success, but the capacity of the GCC to really bail Egypt out of its problems is limited. So, crisis is one thing, addressing the structural issues. There we are, things are bad, but can the government respond? The crisis can be the midwife of reform. Might it be this time? And after all, General Al-Sisi is in control, the military is in control. All the top-down strength that you'd ever want seems to be in place. What about it? Well, on the upside, General Al-Sisi is a much more attractive, powerful, and I believe intelligent figure than his two predecessors, General Tantawi or General Mubarak. And given that, Mubarak was enormously sensitive about his own position, his own powers, and it strikes me he was probably well aware of his limitations and deficiencies, and so could not allow individuals of any real capacities to hold significant positions in the military or in civilian political life. And so they did not, with rare exceptions, and when they rose to a certain point, they were removed. We now have a much stronger figure, whose ego may be bigger and whose assessment of his own capacities, I suspect, is also accurate, but his capacities are greater. And so you can argue that the presence in this current cabinet of some pretty significant types whose are personally known to many of us in this room, is a suggestion not only of the need to have better quality people making economic and to some extent, some very limited extent, political decisions, but is reflective of the fact that people of that magnitude will play a role in Egypt's future. People that have thought about these issues, have written about these issues, who have offered, it strikes me, perfectly reasonable solutions to them. So this is an argument for a strong top-down role. The sort of, you may recall John Waterbury's old argument about the change team. What you needed was a strong government that put a change team of technocrats on the field, back them up, and they would go forth and undertake the reforms necessary.
Tell us more about how you form your assessment of General Sisi. I mean, maybe you end up being the opposite. We've seen so little of him.
Well, I think we saw little of him because I think he's packaged himself extremely well. And the packaging, of course, takes two different time periods, from August of 2012 until the June 30th of this year. He was deferential. He stood in the shadow of the president. He made it clear on a couple of occasions that he was not happy with decisions that were being made. But he handled himself very well, leading one to ask the question, did he seem so deferential because he really wanted the Brotherhood to succeed, and he really had played a role with Morsi and Morsi's colleagues in getting rid of Tantawi? Or was he deferential because he was plotting against Morsi and his colleagues? In either interpretation, he played the role very well. Morsi was saying on the 25th of June how much he trusted the military and how much the military was doing a fine job and so on. So it was Sisi's job to convince Morsi of his reliability and the reliability of the institution, and he convinced him. I personally believe that Sisi conspired against him from day one. And the fact that we have had very little turnover in the Egyptian high command, and in the key positions they remain the same as they were under Tantawi, bespeaks of the fact there was a conspiracy orchestrated. Tantawi had chosen Sisi to be head of military intelligence. So he was impressed by this guy from the beginning. He rose through the ranks very rapidly. He had all the key appointments if you're being prepared for the top position in the Egyptian military. So I think Tantawi essentially had picked Sisi up from his relatively humble origins, saw him as an attractive figure, and backed him. So within the military, Sisi had tremendous respect, and within the American military, Sisi has tremendous respect. Then what he did after 3 July was essentially to take the action in the name of the people that seemed to solidify his role as the new Nasser. And it's significant that Hoda Abdel Nasser has written this open letter saying that if you like my father, you'll love General Sisi. The idea that he is the inheritor of the Nasserist legacy. So he's played his cards extremely well. And so the respect for him is very high. And the style that he has is one that really does exude confidence. It's true to say. He's an impressive guy, and all those who deal with him find him such. So I think he has that sort of self-confidence. He knows his image is very powerful and positive. And so he's not going to, the likes of a finance minister are not going to be a threat, whereas a humble minister of supply would be a threat to Mubarak, and so he'd get rid of a good one. I don't think that will be the case, assuming Sisi is in control, and I think that has to be our operating assumption. So he can tolerate more competition, and therefore more capacity through this change team to tackle some of these reforms. Okay, so that's the positive interpretation. The negative, well, it comes at a cost, right? The military has, surprise, surprise, continued to expand its role within the economy. I see it was announced a couple of weeks ago that a military construction company will be doing the final extension on the ring road, connecting it to the canal. The economic requirements of authoritarian populism are also, they're popular as Sisi might be. It's still an authoritarian regime. And as we mentioned from the World Value Survey, the evaluation of government performance is not in terms of procedure, how democratic are you, it's in terms of what does the government give you. And so no government can afford easily, especially in a transition period, to impose austerity, to give, let's say, greater participation in exchange for austerity, which is a part of the democratic bargain. And so what do we have since the new government has come into place? We have more of the sort of authoritarian populism in terms of distributional measures. And so the first significant act taken, economic act taken by this government, is to raise the minimum wage from 800 to 1,200 pounds. That's the first significant act. And it was clearly done on the orders of the military government, not on the basis of the decision taken by the, quote, change team, suggesting who's got the power. It's the military and not the change team. So these economic requirements will continue. Feed the military beast, and at the same time ensure that the population is provided patronage. So reform, coming through a compromise with people buying into it and playing a role in decision, I think is probably unlikely. Now, Djavad is suggesting we're just about out of time here, I think, and so let us quickly. What are the broader implications for this transition from post-colonial states in the Arab world? Well, one, it's not good news because Egypt is relatively homogeneous, as we all know, relatively institutionalized, and if the transition is difficult for it, very much worse for others. It's facing simultaneously key issues. The issue of identity was fought out in the streets, Islamists versus anti-Islamists, and is a biting issue that has by no means been resolved by the actions of the incumbent government. As we've been talking about, there are a plethora of economic issues yet to be resolved, whether subsidy reform, whether shrinking the civil service, whatever it might be. And then the institutions have been very heavily degraded, not only over the past 32 months, but leading into that period in the final 20 years, let's say, of the Mubarak era. So altogether, they are facing a series of major challenges, any one of which would be significant. MENA is too big to fail. The idea that it doesn't matter what happens in the Arab world, the world is going to bail it out. That here is the area of the world where 2/3 of the world's energy supplies are concentrated, and therefore we cannot let it become Somalia. I'm not so sure of that. I think now that the argument of energy independence, the claim for fracking and all that follows therefrom, this is part of a general gestalt that's now taking a significant prominence in decision-making circles in the world, and especially in Washington, that we don't really need these guys like we used to, that we have a much higher pain threshold than we used to. And so finally then, what are the global implications here? Well, the global architecture is out of date. We have got Gothic buildings when we need super modern ones. We have a Cold War legacy that then became the American hegemonic superpower. And that's where it all stopped, right there. We are not the hegemonic power. We may have been, or at least told ourselves we were. And it was demonstrated in Iraq. It's being amply demonstrated throughout the Arab world. And we are backing away, and no one else is moving in to replace us. Obviously, the answer is multilateralism. Have you heard much about really empowering the United Nations coming out of the Obama administration or anywhere else? What other multilateral framework might there be? And the transition in the Arab world is posing a very significant global threat. No question about it. This is a serious matter. The chemical weapons in Syria being but one case, nuclear issues in Iran, so on. So there are plenty of threats there. And this would be the region that would cause this new architecture to be created, because it's the most threatening of it. And yet, what do we see? We see a real fear of going in there, that the responsibility to protect, the responsibility to be rebuilt are seen as being too big responsibilities, either for us or for this global architecture that's pretty limited. So I think that the Arab world has got problems, and I think it's going to have to deal with those problems more or less on its own. And it's a transition to what I think remains to be seen. We just call it the post-colonial order and leave it at that. Thank you very much.